Number 1. Jeffrey Dahmer, a name that has become synonymous with the darkest depths of human depravity, terrorized the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, during a killing spree that spanned 13 years, though his most active and horrific period culminated in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was the eldest of two sons born to Joyce Annette and Lionel Herbert Dahmer. From a remarkably young age, Dahmer exhibited signs of a deeply troubled psyche, engaging in the dismemberment of dead animals and exhibiting a profound emotional detachment that deeply alarmed his parents, though they were largely consumed by their own volatile marriage and personal struggles. As a teenager, Dahmer's internal turmoil manifested in severe alcoholism, a creeping isolation from his peers, and an increasing obsession with thoughts of dominance, control, and necrophilia. Despite these deeply disturbing undercurrents, Dahmer presented a relatively unremarkable exterior to those who did not look too closely, graduating from Revere High School in Ohio in 1978 before briefly attending Ohio State University. His brief stint in higher education ended abruptly due to his catastrophic alcohol consumption, prompting his father to force him into a stint in the United States Army. Stationed in Germany, Dahmer's erratic behavior and chronic drunkenness ultimately led to his early discharge, initiating a downward spiral that saw him drift across the country, eventually settling back in the Midwest. It was in Milwaukee, moving into the Oxford Apartments at 924 North 25th Street in 1988, that Dahmer would establish the literal house of horrors where he would commit the atrocities that would permanently scar the American consciousness. Dahmer's modus operandi was chillingly consistent and predatory in its simplicity, specifically targeting marginalized individuals, primarily young gay men and runaway youths, whom he believed would not be immediately missed by society or law enforcement. He would typically lure these vulnerable victims back to his apartment using the promise of money, companionship, alcohol, or the opportunity to pose for nude photographs. Once inside the confines of his small, one-bedroom apartment, Dahmer would drug his victims by spiking their drinks with sedatives such as halcion or temazepam. After the victims lost consciousness, Dahmer would strangle them to death, later claiming that the act of taking a life was not driven by a desire to inflict pain, but by a desperate, twisted need to possess them completely and permanently so they could not abandon him. Following the murder, the true extent of Dahmer's psychological fragmentation would emerge as he engaged in elaborate, ritualistic acts of necrophilia and dismemberment. He would often photograph the corpses at various stages of the process, preserving the macabre events on Polaroid film. Dahmer would then use power tools, including a chainsaw and a drill, to dissect the bodies, carefully separating the flesh from the bone. In a grotesque attempt to maintain the presence of his victims, Dahmer would boil the skulls in bleach and paint them to keep them as macabre trophies displayed in his apartment, while other body parts were stored in vats of acid or in his refrigerator. Perhaps most horrifyingly, Dahmer engaged in acts of cannibalism, consuming parts of his victims in a delusional attempt to spiritually merge with them and ensure they became a permanent part of his physical being. For years, Dahmer operated in the shadows of the Oxford Apartments, the foul odor of decaying flesh and the constant hum of his power tools dismissed by neighbors and building management as mere plumbing issues or late-night handyman work, a catastrophic failure of communal awareness that allowed his reign of terror to continue unchecked. The investigation into Jeffrey Dahmer's atrocities began not as a hunt for a serial killer, but through a harrowing stroke of sheer luck and victim resilience on the evening of July 22, 1991. On that night, Dahmer lured a 32-year-old man named Tracy Edwards into his apartment with the promise of money in exchange for posing for photographs. Once inside, Dahmer attempted to subdue Edwards, handcuffing one of his wrists and threatening him with a large hunting knife. In a moment of desperate, adrenaline-fueled clarity, Edwards realized that his survival depended entirely on his ability to overpower his captor and escape. When Dahmer momentarily lowered his guard, distracted by the television or the alcohol he had been consuming, Edwards struck him with a heavy metal dumbbell, causing Dahmer to stumble. Seizing the narrow window of opportunity, Edwards fled the apartment, still wearing one handcuff, and ran into the street where he flagged down two Milwaukee police officers, Robert Roth and Ralph Mueller. Edwards led the officers back to the Oxford apartments, terrified but determined to see his tormentor apprehended. When the officers entered Dahmer's apartment, they were immediately struck by the overwhelming stench of decomposition and the eerie atmosphere of the dimly lit space. A quick sweep of the apartment revealed a horrifying tableau that looked like a scene from a nightmare. Polaroid photographs of dismembered human bodies scattered across the floor, a refrigerator containing 3 human heads, a freezer stocked with human hearts and flesh, and a 57-gallon drum filled with torsos dissolving in acid. Dahmer, attempting to maintain his facade of normalcy, calmly offered the officers a drink, but he was immediately placed under arrest. As detectives from the Milwaukee Police Department descended upon the apartment, the sheer scale of the horror became apparent, transforming the space into one of the most notorious crime scenes in American history. Forensic technicians spent days meticulously cataloging the remains, recovering the bodies of 11 victims within the apartment walls, alongside the macabre collection of skulls, genitalia, and preserved body parts that Dahmer had accumulated over the years. The subsequent interrogation of Dahmer, led by Detective Patrick Kennedy, provided a chilling window into the mind of a killer, as Dahmer confessed to the murders in graphic, unemotional detail, providing investigators with the information needed to identify the victims and piece together the timeline of his 13-year killing spree. Following his arrest, Jeffrey Dahmer was charged with 15 counts of first-degree murder in Wisconsin, along with an additional murder charge in Ohio for his first victim, Stephen Hicks, whom he had killed in 1978. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer commenced on January 30, 1992, in Milwaukee, presided over by Judge Lawrence Graham. The proceedings captivated and horrified the nation, as the prosecution, led by District Attorney E. Michael McCann, laid out the overwhelming physical evidence, the Polaroid photographs, and the gruesome inventory of human remains found in the apartment, painting a picture of unparalleled depravity. The defense, spearheaded by attorney Gerald Boyle, did not attempt to argue Dahmer's innocence, as the evidence was indisputable. Instead, Boyle pursued a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, arguing that Dahmer suffered from a severe mental illness, specifically necrophilia and a borderline personality disorder, which rendered him incapable of controlling his homicidal impulses or understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. A team of psychiatrists and psychologists testified for both the defense and the prosecution, offering conflicting assessments of Dahmer's mental state, with defense experts detailing his deep-seated abandonment issues and his delusional belief that creating zombies out of his victims would keep him from being alone, while prosecution experts countered that Dahmer was fully aware of the criminality of his actions, pointing to his meticulous efforts to conceal his crimes, his evasion of police, and his calculated lies to cover his tracks. After weeks of deeply disturbing testimony and the presentation of over 80 pieces of gruesome evidence, the jury deliberated for approximately 10 hours before rejecting the insanity defense, finding Dahmer legally sane at the time of the murders. On February 17, 1992, Judge Graham sentenced Jeffrey Dahmer to 15 consecutive life sentences, totaling 936 years in prison, ensuring that he would never walk free again. The broader implications of the Dahmer case sent shockwaves through the American legal and social landscape, sparking intense scrutiny of police procedures and societal biases. It was revealed during the investigation that 2 years prior to Dahmer's capture, a 14-year-old victim named Konorak Synthesumphone had actually escaped from Dahmer's apartment and was found wandering the streets in a daze. When police arrived, Dahmer convinced them that the boy was his 19-year-old lover who was simply intoxicated, and the officers returned the boy to Dahmer, who subsequently murdered him. This catastrophic failure by the Milwaukee Police Department, heavily influenced by racial and homophobic assumptions regarding the Asian immigrant boy, led to massive public outrage, internal investigations, and eventual policy overhauls within the department regarding missing persons and the handling of vulnerable populations. Furthermore, the case forced a national conversation about the treatment of marginalized communities by law enforcement, and the systemic blind spots that allowed predators to operate with impunity in the shadows. Jeffrey Dahmer spent the remainder of his life in the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, where he was initially kept in protective isolation due to the extreme notoriety of his crimes and the constant threat to his life from other inmates. Surprisingly, after a year of isolation, Dahmer requested to be integrated into the general prison population, where he claimed he wanted to find a sense of normalcy and participate in religious ministries, even undergoing a bizarre baptism in the prison whirlpool. However, on the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to a cleaning detail with two other inmates, Christopher Scarver and Jesse Anderson. As the three men were left unsupervised in a bathroom area of the prison gymnasium, Scarver, who suffered from severe schizophrenia and harbored a deep-seated hatred for Dahmer's crimes, retrieved a metal bar from a piece of exercise equipment and brutally beat both Dahmer and Anderson. Dahmer was pronounced dead upon arrival at a local hospital, suffering severe head trauma. The aftermath of Dahmer's death brought a complex mix of relief and unresolved grief to the families of his victims, who were simultaneously spared the decades-long ordeal of his appeals process, yet denied the opportunity to see him serve out the sentence handed down by the state. The impact on the victims' families and the Milwaukee community was profound and enduring, as they were forced to grapple with the knowledge that 17 lives had been extinguished in the most horrific manner imaginable, largely because the warning signs had been ignored and the victims had been deemed invisible by the societal structures meant to protect them. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer remains a dark and cautionary chapter in the annals of American criminal history, serving as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked psychological deviance, the catastrophic failures of law enforcement, and the urgent need for a society that values the lives and safety of all its citizens, regardless of their marginalization. Number 2. Richard Ramirez, a man who would come to be known to the terrified public as the Night Stalker, unleashed a wave of horrific violence, sexual assault, and murder upon the city of Los Angeles and its surrounding communities during a reign of terror that lasted from June 1984 until his capture in August 1985. Born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, Ricardo Leyva Muñoz Ramirez was the youngest of 5 children in a deeply troubled and impoverished Mexican-American family. The roots of his future monstrosities were nurtured in an environment defined by severe domestic violence, as his father, a former police officer in Mexico, frequently suffered from violent outbursts and paranoid delusions related to his experiences, often beating his wife and children. Richard himself was deeply affected by this chaotic household, suffering from frequent epileptic seizures as a child and displaying early signs of antisocial behavior, including a troubling fascination with death and violence. This dark trajectory was profoundly accelerated by the influence of his older cousin, Mike, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who returned to El Paso with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and a predilection for extreme violence. Mike would frequently regale the young Richard with graphic stories of his wartime exploits, showing him Polaroid photographs of the atrocities he had committed against Vietnamese civilians, including the rape and mutilation of women. When Richard was just 13 years old, he witnessed Mike murder his own wife, shooting her in the face during a domestic dispute, an event that shattered any remaining psychological boundaries the young boy possessed and cemented his association between violence, power, and sexual gratification. As Ramirez entered adolescence, his behavior escalated from macabre curiosity to active criminality, beginning with petty theft, breaking and entering, and drug abuse. He developed a heavy addiction to cocaine, which further eroded his already fractured psyche and fueled his paranoid, aggressive tendencies. After dropping out of high school, Ramirez drifted to California in the late 1970s, initially surviving through burglary and petty crime in the San Francisco Bay Area. However, it was in the sweltering summer of 1984 that his criminal behavior mutated into a pattern of predatory violence that would paralyze the second-largest city in America. Ramirez's modus operandi was characterized by a chilling randomness and a brazen lack of caution, as he would typically stalk middle-class residential neighborhoods at night, targeting single-story homes that he could easily access through unlocked windows or doors. Armed with a variety of weapons, including handguns, knives, and a machete, he would invade the homes of his sleeping victims, often waking them by shining a flashlight in their faces before unleashing a barrage of violence. He did not discriminate in his choice of victims, targeting men, women, and the elderly, but his most sadistic and predatory impulses were reserved for the women he encountered, whom he subjected to brutal sexual assaults, forced to perform degrading acts, and often mutilated in the aftermath. What made the Night Stalker crimes uniquely terrifying was the ritualistic and satanic element that Ramirez injected into the crime scenes, compelling his victims to swear allegiance to Satan, drawing pentagrams on the walls in lipstick or blood, and forcing victims to recite demonic incantations. This theatrical component, combined with the sheer brutality of the attacks, created an atmosphere of pervasive panic throughout Los Angeles, as residents realized that the killer was striking without discernible pattern or motive, moving freely through different neighborhoods and police jurisdictions. The investigation into the Night Stalker crimes was one of the largest and most complex in Los Angeles Police Department history, involving hundreds of detectives, the creation of a dedicated task force, and the utilization of the then nascent Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, to analyze the behavioral signatures left at the crime scenes. Despite the overwhelming allocation of resources, the investigation was plagued by a lack of physical evidence, as Ramirez was meticulous about not leaving fingerprints and frequently wore a baseball cap to avoid leaving hair fibers. The breakthrough in the case came from a combination of old-fashioned detective work and a stroke of incredible fortune. On August 24, 1985, Ramirez attempted to murder a couple in Mission Viejo, but the male victim fought back aggressively, causing Ramirez to flee the scene in a stolen vehicle. During the struggle, Ramirez left behind a single, critical piece of evidence, a footprint from an obvious sneaker, a relatively uncommon shoe at the time, which allowed investigators to narrow down the suspect pool. More importantly, on August 29, Ramirez traveled to a residential neighborhood in East Los Angeles, where he attempted to pull a woman from her car. The woman screamed, alerting her husband, who gave chase. Ramirez fled on foot, but the neighborhood, already on high alert due to the pervasive media coverage of the Night Stalker, mobilized instantly. Residents began chasing Ramirez through the streets, eventually cornering him in an alley. Unaware of the mob closing in on him, Ramirez attempted to carjack another vehicle, but the driver resisted, and the angry crowd descended upon him, beating him severely before police arrived to take him into custody. When officers finally pulled the bloodied and disoriented Ramirez from the mob, they discovered that he was wearing a significant piece of evidence, a distinctive diamond ring that had been stolen from one of his earlier murder victims. Following his arrest, the legal proceedings against Richard Ramirez became a media spectacle of unprecedented proportions, reflecting the intense fear and fascination he had generated during his reign of terror. The trial began in the summer of 1989 in downtown Los Angeles, presided over by Judge Michael Tynan, and was characterized by chaotic disruptions, bizarre outbursts from the defendant, and a highly unusual dynamic between Ramirez and a group of female followers who attended the trial daily, an adoring fan club that called themselves the Night Stalker Girls, who would sit in the courtroom applying makeup and blowing kisses to the man accused of unspeakable atrocities. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorneys Phil Halpin and Alan Yokelson, presented a devastating mountain of evidence, connecting Ramirez to the crime scenes through the stolen jewelry. The obvious sneaker footprint, firearms recovered after his arrest that were ballistically matched to the murders, and the powerful testimony of the survivors who identified him in court. The defense, led by attorneys Daniel Hernandez and Arturo Hernandez, did not deny that Ramirez had committed the crimes, but instead attempted to argue that he was legally insane, suffering from a severe form of antisocial personality disorder, schizophrenia, and an addiction to Satanism that rendered him incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. A battery of psychiatric experts testified for both sides, with prosecution experts asserting that Ramirez was fully aware of his actions, pointing to his calculated efforts to evade capture and his attempts to destroy evidence, while defense experts painted a picture of a man whose brain had been irrevocably damaged by childhood trauma, epilepsy, and substance abuse. The jury, after months of testimony and deliberation, flatly rejected the insanity defense, finding Ramirez guilty of 13 counts of first-degree murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. In November 1989, Judge Tynan formally sentenced Richard Ramirez to death, ordering him to be executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison, a sentence that Ramirez received with a smirk and a raised fist, shouting, "Hail Satan," as he was led from the courtroom. The broader implications of the Night Stalker case extended far beyond the individual crimes, forcing a profound reckoning within the city of Los Angeles regarding the intersection of media coverage, public panic, and law enforcement strategy. The relentless, around-the-clock media coverage of the killings, which provided the moniker Night Stalker, inadvertently created a feedback loop of terror, empowering Ramirez by amplifying his perceived power and leaving millions of citizens feeling utterly defenseless in their own homes. The case exposed significant vulnerabilities in interagency communication, as early crimes committed in different jurisdictions were not immediately linked, allowing Ramirez to operate with a degree of freedom that a more cohesive investigative framework might have prevented. Furthermore, the bizarre phenomenon of the Night Stalker girls sparked a disturbing national conversation about the psychology of hybristophilia, the condition where individuals are sexually or romantically attracted to people who have committed terrible crimes, highlighting the complex and often uncomfortable relationship between extreme criminality and public notoriety. Richard Ramirez spent the subsequent decades on death row at San Quentin State Prison, largely isolated from the general prison population but continuing to maintain his unrepentant, satanic persona, granting occasional interviews in which he expressed no remorse for his actions. During his incarceration, Ramirez developed a relationship with a freelance magazine editor named Doreen Leary, whom he married in 1996 while still on death row, a bizarre footnote that further cemented his legacy as a figure of dark celebrity. Ultimately, justice, or at least the finality of death, came not through the legal system Ramirez had mocked, but through natural causes. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at the age of 53 from complications related to B-cell lymphoma, a form of blood cancer, while still awaiting execution. The impact of his crimes on the victims, their families, and the collective psyche of Los Angeles remains indelible, as the Night Stalker case forever altered the way Americans viewed home security, the vulnerability of suburban sanctuaries, and the terrifying reality that evil could walk through an unlocked door on a quiet summer night. Number 3. Edmund Kemper III, a towering physical specimen who stood 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighed over 250 pounds, was a brutal serial killer whose horrific crimes in the early 1970s permanently branded the coastal community of Santa Cruz, California, as the murder capital of the world at the time. A reputation that stemmed directly from the sheer brutality and intimate nature of his killings. Born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, Kemper was the middle child of a highly dysfunctional family, raised primarily by his mother, Clonel Strandberg Kemper, an alcoholic woman who possessed a deeply volatile temperament and a penchant for psychological cruelty. From a very young age, Edmund exhibited signs of extreme psychological disturbance, engaging in acts of animal cruelty that escalated from torturing the family cats to ultimately decapitating them and burying their heads in his backyard as a young teenager. His relationship with his mother was characterized by a toxic combination of intense hatred and a pathological need for her approval, a dynamic that psychologists would later identify as the central driving force behind his homicidal rage. Clonel frequently belittled her son, mocking his immense size and referring to him as a real weirdo, while simultaneously enforcing a strict, oppressive household rule set that left Edmund feeling emasculated and deeply resentful. By the time he was a teenager, his behavior had become too extreme for his mother to manage, leading her to banish him to live with his grandparents on a remote farm in the Sierra Nevada foothills. It was in this isolated environment that Edmund Kemper committed his first murders at the age of 15, shooting both of his grandparents to death with a rifle that his grandfather had given him as a gift. When questioned by authorities, Kemper offered a chillingly calm explanation, stating that he simply wanted to know what it felt like to kill his grandmother, and that he shot his grandfather so the old man would not have to see what had happened to his wife. Due to his youth, Kemper was not tried as an adult but was instead committed to the Atascadero State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, a maximum security psychiatric facility where he was housed alongside some of the most dangerous and damaged individuals in the California penal system. Rather than acting as a deterrent, or a place of healing, Kemper's time at Atascadero proved to be a macabre university where he honed his understanding of criminal psychology, undergoing extensive psychological testing and learning how to manipulate the very psychiatric professionals tasked with treating him. He became a highly valued asset to the hospital staff, even working as a psychological test administrator, an experience that allowed him to intimately study the diagnostic criteria for various mental illnesses and learn exactly what answers psychiatrists wanted to hear in order to secure a release. After several years of demonstrating what appeared to be remarkable rehabilitation, Kemper was released into the custody of his mother, who had relocated to Santa Cruz, California, a vibrant coastal town and college community known for its progressive attitudes and laid-back lifestyle. Kemper attempted to reintegrate into society, securing a job with the California Highway Patrol as a state traffic safety worker, a position that gave him access to police radios, uniforms, and a deep familiarity with law enforcement protocols, tools he would later use to evade capture. However, the simmering rage toward his mother and women in general continued to fester beneath his carefully constructed facade of normalcy, and by 1972, the urge to kill resurfaced with a terrifying intensity. Kemper began cruising the highways around Santa Cruz, specifically targeting young female hitchhikers, a demographic he knew was prevalent in the counterculture hub and whose transient nature he believed would make them less likely to be immediately missed. His modus operandi was deceptively simple and relied heavily on his imposing physical presence and his ability to project an aura of harmlessness. He would pull his vehicle alongside a young woman, engage her in friendly conversation, and offer her a ride. Once the victim was inside the car, Kemper would drive to a remote, isolated area, where he would suddenly produce a handgun, a knife, or a hammer, and murder them, often by shooting or stabbing them. Following the murder, Kemper would transport the bodies back to his apartment, where he engaged in horrific acts of post-mortem mutilation, decapitating the victims, dissecting their remains, and committing acts of necrophilia. He would often dispose of the bodies by dumping them in remote ravines or coastal cliffs, taking care to separate the heads from the torsos to prevent identification through dental records. Between May 1972 and February 1973, Kemper murdered 6 young women, including 2 college co-eds from the University of California, Santa Cruz, a 15-year-old girl, and a high school student, leaving a trail of horror that paralyzed the community and triggered a massive manhunt by local and state law enforcement. The investigation into what the media dubbed the co-ed murders was a frustrating and chaotic endeavor for the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office and the California Highway Patrol. Detectives were baffled by the complete absence of a clear motive and the killer's ability to abduct and murder women without leaving any witnesses or significant physical evidence at the dump sites. The fact that Kemper possessed a deep understanding of police procedures from his time working for the Highway Patrol allowed him to anticipate investigative strategies, leading authorities down numerous dead ends. Kemper would frequently call the police officers he knew from his job, engaging them in casual conversations about the ongoing investigation, asking for details about the crime scenes and offering his own theories about the killer's psychology, a chilling game of cat and mouse that demonstrated his supreme arrogance and need for recognition. The turning point in the investigation, and the event that ultimately led to Kemper's downfall, was not the result of a brilliant forensic breakthrough, but rather the killer's own psychological compulsion to escalate his violence to its inevitable conclusion. On Easter weekend in April 1973, Edmund Kemper finally acted upon the desire that had driven his entire homicidal career, turning his rage upon the source of his psychological torment, his mother, Clarnell. In the early morning hours of April 21st, while his mother was sleeping in her apartment, Kemper entered her bedroom and attacked her with a claw hammer, bludgeoning her to death. He then decapitated her body, committed acts of necrophilia with her severed head, and used her vocal cords as a dartboard in a final, grotesque act of symbolic revenge. Following the murder of his mother, Kemper invited over one of her friends, a 59-year-old woman named Sally Hallett, and murdered her as well, knowing she would be a witness to the bloodbath. Having eliminated the two women in his life who represented his deepest sources of frustration and control, Kemper's psychological narrative was complete, and the elaborate facade he had maintained for years simply collapsed. Instead of fleeing or attempting to cover up the crimes, Kemper got into his car and drove eastward, eventually stopping at a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado, where he called the Santa Cruz Police Department. He initially asked to speak to an officer he knew, but upon being told the officer was not available, he calmly confessed to the murders, stating that he had killed his mother and that he was the co-ed killer the police had been hunting for months. The dispatcher, initially believing it was a prank call, asked Kemper to hold, a request that Kemper obliged, remaining on the line until officers arrived to verify the claims. When Santa Cruz police finally entered Colonel Kemper's apartment, they found the horrific scene exactly as Kemper had described, confirming that the nightmare that had gripped their community was finally over. The trial of Edmund Kemper commenced in the fall of 1973 in a Santa Cruz courtroom, a proceeding that was as remarkable for the defendant's demeanor as it was for the horrific nature of the crimes. Kemper, who stood nearly 7 feet tall, shocked the court by waiving his right to a jury trial and instead opting for a bench trial, where the verdict would be decided solely by the judge. Furthermore, he pleaded guilty to all charges, eliminating the need for a lengthy and graphic trial that would have forced the victims' families to relive the trauma. The primary focus of the proceedings shifted to the sanity phase, where Kemper's defense attorneys argued that their client was legally insane at the time of the murders, citing his deeply disturbed childhood, his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, and the profound psychological damage inflicted by his mother. However, in a calculated move that surprised many observers, Kemper took the stand himself and actively argued against the insanity defense, delivering a chillingly articulate and rational testimony in which he described his crimes in meticulous detail and explicitly stated that he knew exactly what he was doing and that he understood the consequences of his actions. He told the court that he was being punished for what he had done and that he deserved to die for his crimes, a statement that was interpreted by many as a final act of manipulation designed to ensure his transfer to a prison rather than a psychiatric facility, which he viewed as a softer environment. The judge, after hearing the testimony and reviewing the extensive psychiatric evaluations, agreed with Kemper's own assessment, finding him legally sane and fully responsible for his actions. On November 8, 1973, Edmund Kemper was sentenced to concurrent life sentences for the 8 murders, with the judge recommending that he never be granted parole. The broader implications of the Edmund Kemper case were profound and far-reaching, exposing the severe limitations of the psychiatric and criminal justice systems in dealing with individuals who possessed both extreme intelligence and a profound capacity for violence. The fact that Kemper had been able to manipulate the staff at Atascadero State Hospital, a facility designed to house the most dangerous psychiatric patients in the state, and secure his release only to embark on an even more lethal killing spree, raised serious questions about the efficacy of rehabilitation programs for violent offenders and the reliability of psychological assessments in predicting future dangerousness. The case also highlighted the unique vulnerabilities of the Santa Cruz community during that era, a place where the counterculture movement's emphasis on freedom and trust created an environment where young people felt safe hitchhiking, a perceived safety that a predator like Kemper was able to exploit with devastating efficiency. Furthermore, Kemper's extensive cooperation with law enforcement following his arrest, including his willingness to provide detailed confessions and psychological insights into his own criminal behavior, made him one of the most studied serial killers in history, providing a foundational case study for the emerging field of criminal profiling at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agents from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, including pioneers like John Douglas and Robert Ressler, conducted extensive interviews with Kemper, utilizing his articulate and self-aware explanations of his crimes to develop the theoretical frameworks that would later be used to profile and capture other serial offenders. Edmund Kemper remains incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California, where he has spent the past 5 decades as a model prisoner, accumulating an extensive library of books, participating in prison programs, and continuing to be a subject of intense fascination for criminologists and true crime enthusiasts alike. Despite his repeated appearances before parole boards, his requests for release have been consistently and unequivocally denied, with officials recognizing that the depth of his psychopathy and the meticulous premeditation of his crimes render him an unacceptable risk to society. The impact of Kemper's crimes on the families of his victims and the Santa Cruz community was devastating and permanent, shattering the idyllic image of the coastal town and leaving a legacy of grief and trauma that persists to this day. The case of Edmund Kemper serves as a grim and enduring reminder of the terrifying potential that lies beneath the facade of normalcy, the devastating consequences of unchecked psychological trauma, and the critical importance of a criminal justice system that must constantly balance the desire for rehabilitation with the imperative of public safety. Number 4. Joseph James DeAngelo, a man who evaded the grasp of law enforcement for over 4 decades while operating under a series of terrifying monikers including the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and ultimately the Golden State Killer, was responsible for one of the most sprawling and terrifying campaigns of violence in American history. A campaign that spanned from 1974 to 1986 and left a permanent scar on the state of California. Born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, Joseph DeAngelo was the eldest of 4 children in a family that would eventually migrate across the country before settling in the Sacramento area of California during his teenage years. To the outside world, DeAngelo appeared to be a remarkably unremarkable individual, a quiet, clean-cut young man who excelled enough academically to attend Sierra College and later California State University, Sacramento, where he earned a degree in criminal justice, a darkly ironic educational choice that would ultimately serve his predatory desires. Following his graduation, DeAngelo fulfilled a childhood ambition by enrolling in the police academy and subsequently joining the Exeter Police Department in Tulare County as a uniformed officer in 1973. He later transferred to the Auburn Police Department in Placer County, where he served for a brief period before being fired in 1979 for stealing a can of dog repellent and a hammer from a drugstore, an incident that effectively ended his formal law enforcement career but did nothing to quell the violent impulses that had been brewing within him for years. The criminal trajectory of Joseph DeAngelo is now understood by investigators and criminologists to have begun in the small agricultural town of Visalia, California, in 1974, where a series of home invasions and burglaries earned the unknown perpetrator the title of the Visalia Ransacker. During this early phase, DeAngelo would break into homes at night, ransacking them for small items of value, specifically focusing on women's undergarments and personal photographs, while the occupants slept, displaying a disturbing intimacy with his victims' private lives. The Visalia Ransacker phase escalated to violence in September 1975 when DeAngelo shot and killed a local journalism professor named Claude Snelling, who interrupted the attacker while he was attempting to kidnap the professor's teenage daughter from her bedroom. Despite an intensive investigation by the Visalia Police Department, DeAngelo slipped away, and the ransackings ceased in the area, only to re-emerge in a far more violent and terrifying form in the suburban communities surrounding Sacramento in the summer of 1976. It was in the quiet, middle-class neighborhoods of Rancho Cordova, Citrus Heights, and Carmichael that DeAngelo transformed from a voyeuristic burglar into one of the most prolific and feared serial rapists in American history, an entity that would come to be known as the East Area Rapist. DeAngelo's methodology during the East Area Rapist phase was characterized by a chilling blend of meticulous planning, psychological warfare, and overwhelming physical aggression. He would spend weeks, if not months, stalking his victims, learning their daily routines, the layout of their homes, and the habits of their neighbors. He typically targeted single women or couples living in single-story residences near schools, parks, or greenbelts, locations that provided him with easy escape routes and concealment. Prior to an attack, DeAngelo would often conduct what investigators later termed a pre-surveillance campaign, making prank phone calls to the victim's residence, hanging up when they answered, and sometimes speaking in a low, guttural voice, a tactic designed to instill fear and establish a psychological dominance long before the physical assault occurred. He would also frequently break into the victim's home in the days leading up to the attack, disabling exterior lighting, unlocking windows, and leaving items like dishes or rope on the bed as a terrifying signal that he had been inside. When DeAngelo finally struck, he did so in the dead of night, wearing a ski mask or a balaclava, often armed with a handgun and a large knife, and sometimes shoeless to muffle the sound of his footsteps. He would awaken the victims by shining a flashlight in their faces, immediately binding them with pre-cut lengths of twine or rope that he brought to the scene, and then subjecting the female victims to prolonged, brutal sexual assaults while the male victims were forced to lie bound and blindfolded, listening helplessly to the atrocities being inflicted upon their partners. DeAngelo maintained an absolute, terrifying control over his victims, whispering threats, grunting, and occasionally crying, displaying a range of emotional volatility that convinced victims they were dealing with a completely unpredictable and unstable individual. Over the course of approximately 50 confirmed attacks in the Sacramento area, DeAngelo's behavior escalated, and he began to leave behind specific calling cards, including a distinctive knot-tying technique used to bind his victims, which became a signature for investigators. As law enforcement pressure intensified in the Sacramento area, DeAngelo shifted his hunting grounds southward, moving to the San Francisco Bay Area, specifically targeting communities in Contra Costa County, Alameda County, and Santa Clara County, where he continued his campaign of terror with undiminished ferocity. Throughout this period, DeAngelo demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to evade capture, slipping away from crime scenes moments before police arrived, outrunning patrol cars on foot, and utilizing his deep understanding of police procedures and perimeter containment tactics, knowledge he had acquired during his time as a police officer, to stay one step ahead of the massive task forces assembled to catch him. The investigation into the East Area Rapist was one of the largest and most frustrating in California history, involving dozens of local, state, and federal agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which established a dedicated VICAP unit specifically to analyze the behavioral patterns of the offender. Detectives compiled thousands of pages of reports, collected hundreds of pieces of physical evidence, including fingerprints, shoe prints, and biological samples, and interviewed thousands of suspects, all to no avail. The sheer volume of evidence collected, while ultimately serving as the key to his identification decades later, became an overwhelming logistical burden for investigators in the pre-digital era, as cross-referencing data across multiple jurisdictions was a manual, time-consuming process that allowed crucial connections to go unnoticed. In 1978, the trajectory of DeAngelo's criminal career underwent its most terrifying evolution when he crossed the ultimate threshold from sexual violence to murder. In February of that year, he attacked a couple in Rancho Cordova, and for the first time, instead of fleeing the scene after the assault, he retrieved a weapon and shot both victims, killing the male victim, a magazine editor named Brian Maggiore, when the couple attempted to escape. This escalation marked the beginning of what would become known as the original Night Stalker phase, a period in which DeAngelo transitioned from being a rapist who occasionally used lethal force to a calculated serial killer who murdered to eliminate witnesses and satisfy an escalating bloodlust. Between 1979 and 1986, DeAngelo is believed to have murdered at least 13 people across Southern California, targeting couples in their homes and communities stretching from Ventura County to Irvine in Orange County. The methodology during these murders was consistent with his earlier attacks, involving nighttime home invasions, the use of bindings, and a terrifying level of control, but the outcome was far more final, as he bludgeoned or shot the victims, often leaving the bodies in grotesque poses. The investigation into the original Night Stalker murders was initially treated as a completely separate series of crimes from the East Area Rapist cases, a catastrophic failure of interagency communication that allowed DeAngelo to operate with impunity across the state. It was not until the early 2000s that a detective named Paul Holes, working with the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, painstakingly connected the ballistic evidence from the Maggiore murder to the subsequent Southern California homicides, definitively proving that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same individual. This monumental breakthrough led to the creation of the unified moniker, the Golden State Killer, but despite knowing that a single perpetrator was responsible for over 50 rapes and 13 murders, investigators were no closer to identifying him. For years, the case went cold, a frustrating and painful reality for the victims and the families of the deceased, who were left without answers or justice. The turning point in the decades-long hunt for Joseph DeAngelo finally arrived in 2018, not through traditional detective work, but through the revolutionary application of forensic genetic genealogy, a cutting-edge scientific technique that would fundamentally change the landscape of cold case investigations. Investigators, working in conjunction with the FBI and a private laboratory, took DNA evidence recovered from a crime scene in the original Night Stalker cases and uploaded a partial genetic profile to a public genealogy database called GeneMatch, which allows individuals to upload their DNA results from commercial testing companies like Ancestry or 23andMe to find distant relatives. By analyzing the familial matches generated by the database, a genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter was able to construct an extensive family tree that traced the DNA back to a great-great-grandparents, ultimately identifying a pool of potential suspects who were male descendants of that family line. Investigators then methodically narrowed down the suspect pool by cross-referencing the genetic age profile, geographic location, and physical characteristics of the descendants with the known parameters of the Golden State Killer. After weeks of meticulous genealogical and detective work, the investigation zeroed in on Joseph James DeAngelo, a retired mechanic living in a quiet suburb of Sacramento. To confirm the genetic match without alerting DeAngelo to the investigation, investigators conducted a covert surveillance operation, waiting for DeAngelo to leave his home, and then secretly collecting a discarded DNA sample from a tissue he had left in a public trash can. The sample was rushed to a forensic laboratory, where it was conclusively matched to the DNA recovered from the Golden State Killer crime scenes, providing an absolute, irrefutable scientific link to the decades-old atrocities. On April 18, 2018, a team of law enforcement officers descended upon DeAngelo's home in Citrus Heights, California, and placed the 72-year-old former police officer under arrest. When the officers entered the home, they found DeAngelo sitting in a chair, and as he was being taken into custody, he reportedly muttered the words, "I did all those things." A partial acknowledgement that brought a measure of closure to the thousands of individuals whose lives had been shattered by his crimes. The legal proceedings against Joseph DeAngelo were complex and protracted, reflecting the sheer scale and geographic spread of his criminal history. Due to the logistical impossibility of trying a defendant for over 50 rapes and 13 murders in a single trial, prosecutors from multiple California counties agreed to consolidate the case in Sacramento County. Facing an overwhelming mountain of evidence, including the definitive DNA match, the ballistic analysis, and the painstakingly compiled behavioral analysis that linked him to every crime scene, DeAngelo's defense team ultimately engaged in extensive plea negotiations. In June 2020, DeAngelo formally pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to numerous special circumstances, including murder during the commission of a burglary and rape, as part of a comprehensive plea agreement that spared him the death penalty. The plea deal also required DeAngelo to make a detailed, sworn confession to all of the crimes he had committed, providing victims and their families with a public acknowledgement of his guilt and a detailed account of what had happened to them. The sentencing hearing, held over several days in August 2020, was a deeply emotional and historic event, as scores of victims and family members of the deceased were given the opportunity to deliver victim impact statements directly to DeAngelo, many of whom confronted the elderly killer with decades of pent-up rage, grief, and defiance. On August 21, 2020, Judge Michael Bowman sentenced Joseph James DeAngelo to multiple consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that ensured he would die in custody. The broader implications of the Golden State Killer case are nothing short of revolutionary, as the successful identification and capture of Joseph DeAngelo served as the watershed moment for the use of forensic genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. The case demonstrated that the vast, voluntarily populated databases of commercial DNA testing companies could be leveraged by law enforcement to solve the most intractable cold cases, a revelation that simultaneously offered hope to thousands of families of murder victims and sparked a fierce national debate about privacy, genetic data ownership, and the ethical boundaries of state surveillance. In the wake of the DeAngelo arrest, Dozens of other cold cases across the country were solved using the same methodology, leading to the identification and prosecution of numerous other serial offenders who had believed they had successfully evaded justice. Furthermore, the case exposed the devastating, lifelong impact of sexual trauma, as the survivors of the East Area rapist attacks, many of whom had suffered in silence for decades, were finally able to share their stories and demand recognition of the profound psychological damage inflicted upon them. Joseph DeAngelo is currently incarcerated at the California Health Care Facility in Stockton, California, serving out his life sentences in a facility equipped to handle the medical needs of an elderly inmate. The impact of his crimes on the state of California and the field of criminology is immeasurable, as the Golden State Killer case forced a complete reevaluation of how law enforcement agencies share information across jurisdictions, how sexual assault evidence is processed and preserved, and how the boundaries of forensic science can be pushed to achieve justice when all other avenues have been exhausted. The case stands as a testament to the relentless perseverance of the detectives, like Paul Holes, who refused to let the case die, and to the incredible power of modern science to pierce through the veil of anonymity that predators like Joseph DeAngelo relied upon to enact their horrors in the darkness. Number 5. Wayne Kenneth Williams, the man at the center of one of the most controversial and terrifying serial murder cases in American history, was convicted of murdering 2 young men in Atlanta, Georgia, and is widely believed by law enforcement and the public to be responsible for the deaths of at least 23 children and young adults between 1979 and 1981. A killing spree that plunged a thriving southern metropolis into a state of unprecedented panic and racial turmoil. Born on May 27, 1958, in Atlanta, Wayne Williams grew up in a middle-class African-American family, raised by parents who were both educators, his father working as a photographer and his mother as a teacher. From a relatively young age, Williams exhibited a driving ambition to succeed in the entertainment industry, harboring dreams of becoming a talent agent, a music promoter, and a radio personality. He cultivated a persona of youthful hustle and entrepreneurial drive, frequently hanging around radio stations, record stores, and local talent shows, attempting to network with industry professionals and discover new musical acts. However, despite his grand aspirations, Williams struggled to gain a genuine foothold in the highly competitive Atlanta music scene, a frustration that bred a deep sense of resentment, and a feeling of being marginalized by an industry and a society he believed did not fully appreciate his talents. This underlying anger, combined with a highly manipulative personality and a documented history of impersonating police officers and lying about his connections, created a psychological profile that investigators would later identify as the foundation for his violent outbursts. The tragedy that would become known as the Atlanta child murders began in the summer of 1979, when the body of a 14-year-old boy named Alfred Evans was discovered in a vacant lot, followed shortly thereafter by the discovery of another missing youth, Edward Smith. Over the next 2 years, the bodies of predominantly young African-American males, ranging in age from 9 to 28, continued to surface with horrifying regularity in wooded areas, rivers, and vacant lots across the city of Atlanta. The victims shared few obvious demographic or social connections beyond their race and gender, leading investigators on a frustrating and chaotic search for a motive and a suspect. As the body count climbed into the double digits, the atmosphere in Atlanta's African-American community transformed from confusion to absolute terror. As parents kept their children indoors, schools implemented strict curfews, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability gripped neighborhoods that had previously felt safe. The investigation into the murders was a massive, sprawling endeavor that ultimately involved the Atlanta Police Department, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which established one of the largest task forces in its history at the time. Despite the overwhelming allocation of resources, the investigation was plagued by a series of catastrophic missteps, jurisdictional infighting, and a fundamental disconnect between the largely white law enforcement leadership and the traumatized black community they were sworn to protect. Early theories posited that the killings were the work of a white supremacist group operating in the area, a theory that gained significant traction due to the historical context of racial violence in the American South. Other theories suggested a connection to a local child prostitution ring or a satanic cult. However, as the evidence accumulated, a different picture began to emerge, one that pointed not to an external conspiracy, but to a predator operating from within the community itself. The break in the case came not from a traditional investigative breakthrough, but from a controversial and highly criticized tactic employed by the task force, a stakeout of the bridges spanning the Chattahoochee River, the body of water where several of the victims had been recovered. In the early morning hours of May 22, 1981, a police surveillance team stationed on the Jackson Parkway Bridge heard a loud splash in the dark waters below. Moments later, a station wagon driven by Wayne Williams crossed over the bridge and was pulled over by the waiting officers. Williams, who was 23 years old at the time, offered a series of contradictory explanations for his presence on the bridge at 3 a.m, initially claiming he was checking on a construction site, then stating he was looking for a dress to deliver a demo tape. The officers noted that Williams was dressed in a manner inconsistent with his explanations, and that there was a distinct damp spot on the front of his shirt. 2 days after the encounter on the bridge, the nude body of a 27-year-old man named Nathaniel Cater was recovered from the Chattahoochee River downstream, and a medical examiner determined that he had died from asphyxiation, likely drowning, shortly before his body was discovered. The timing and location of Cater's recovery, coupled with Williams's presence on the bridge the night the splash was heard, led investigators to focus their attention exclusively on the young, smooth-talking promoter. Following the stakeout encounter, investigators meticulously examined Williams's background, his vehicle, and his home. They discovered that Williams possessed a striking ability to ingratiate himself with young boys and teenagers, using the lure of the music industry and the promise of recording sessions or auditions to gain their trust. Several witnesses came forward to state that they had seen Williams in the company of various victims prior to their disappearances, and a search of his home and vehicles yielded a collection of seemingly mundane items that would become critically important at trial, including dog hair, fibers from a specialized carpet, and various pieces of clothing. The forensic evidence, while largely circumstantial, was painstakingly assembled by FBI experts who utilized emerging techniques in fiber and hair analysis to link Williams to the victims. The prosecution's theory was that Williams would lure his victims with the promise of a career in music, murder them in his home or vehicle, and then dispose of their bodies in the Chattahoochee River, utilizing the bridges as convenient, secluded drop points under the cover of darkness. In January 1982, Wayne Williams was brought to trial in Fulton County, Georgia, not for the entirety of the 23 murders, but specifically for the deaths of Nathaniel Cater and another young man, Jimmy Ray Payne, whose body had been recovered from the river weeks earlier. The decision to try Williams for only 2 adult murders was a strategic calculation by the prosecution, designed to secure a conviction without having to present the overwhelming and potentially confusing volume of evidence associated with the child murders, with the expectation that a conviction in these 2 cases would effectively close the entire investigation. The trial was a tense and highly publicized affair, marked by intense racial dynamics and a fierce battle between some of the most prominent legal minds in the country. The prosecution, led by Fulton County District Attorney Louis Slayton, presented a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, specifically the fiber analysis. FBI experts testified that microscopic fibers recovered from the bodies of Cater and Payne matched fibers found in Williams's home, his vehicles, and even his dog, a match they characterized as so rare that it pointed to Williams as the only logical source. They also presented testimony regarding the river stakeout, the loud splash, and Williams's contradictory statements to police. The defense, led by a high-powered team of attorneys including Al Binder and Robert Campbell, aggressively attacked the prosecution's case, arguing that the fiber evidence was junk science, that the statistical probabilities presented by the FBI were mathematically flawed and misleading, and that the police had targeted Williams from the moment they saw him on the bridge because he was a convenient scapegoat. The defense suggested that the real killer or killers were still at large and pointed to the lack of direct eyewitnesses, confessions, or definitive murder weapons. After a trial lasting several weeks, the jury deliberated for approximately 10 hours before finding Wayne Williams guilty of the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. He was subsequently sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. Following the trial, the Atlanta Police Department and the FBI officially closed the books on the Atlanta child murders, attributing 22 of the 23 deaths to Williams, a declaration that was met with widespread skepticism and anger within the African American community. The broader implications of the Wayne Williams case and the Atlanta child murders are profound and continue to resonate today, as the case exposed the deep racial fissures in American society and the catastrophic consequences of a justice system that fails to earn the trust of the communities it serves. The initial assumption by many in the black community that a white supremacist group was responsible for the killings was not born out of paranoia, but out of a deeply rooted historical reality, and the perceived dismissal of this theory by white law enforcement officials exacerbated an already tense relationship. Furthermore, the case highlighted the devastating impact of institutional neglect on marginalized communities, as the initial disappearances of poor black children did not elicit the same level of urgent media attention or police resources that would have been mobilized had the victims been white and affluent. The controversy surrounding the forensic evidence used to convict Williams, particularly the fiber analysis, has only grown in the decades since the trial, as the scientific community has increasingly questioned the reliability of hair comparison and fiber analysis, techniques that have been implicated in numerous wrongful conviction cases across the country. In recent years, a renewed push by activists, journalists, and family members of the victims to reopen the case has gained momentum, aided by the availability of advanced DNA testing that was non-existent at the time of the murders. In 2019, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms ordered a re-examination of the evidence in the case, directing police to resubmit DNA and other physical evidence to modern laboratories in an attempt to definitively link Williams to the child victims or, conversely, to identify alternative suspects if the evidence does not match. While this re-examination has not yet resulted in any definitive exonerations or new charges, it represents a significant acknowledgement by the city that the trauma inflicted upon the community by the Atlanta child murders was never fully resolved by the conviction of Wayne Williams. Wayne Williams remains incarcerated at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison in Jackson, Georgia, where he has consistently maintained his innocence, denying any involvement in the murders and claiming that he was framed by a corrupt and desperate police force. The impact of the Atlanta child murders on the victims' families and the city of Atlanta is an enduring wound, a chapter of history that forced a vibrant, progressive southern city to confront the darkest aspects of its racial and socioeconomic divides, and a case that continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of circumstantial evidence, the importance of community trust in law enforcement, and the agonizing, unfinished nature of grief when justice feels incomplete. Number 6. Robert Hansen, a quiet, unassuming baker who operated a small shop in the heart of downtown Anchorage, Alaska, was secretly living a horrific double life as one of the most prolific and calculating serial killers in American history, a man who used the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Alaskan frontier as his personal burial ground, murdering and burying at least 17 women over a span of 12 years. Born on February 15, 1939, in Esterville, Iowa, Robert Christian Hansen was a deeply troubled youth who suffered from a profound sense of inadequacy exacerbated by a severe stutter, chronic acne, and a deeply overbearing and highly critical father. Throughout his childhood and adolescence, Hansen was relentlessly bullied and ostracized by his peers, experiences that bred a simmering, toxic resentment toward women, whom he perceived as unattainable and cruel, a psychological wound that would fester and mutate into violent rage over the course of his life. His early criminal behavior included petty arson, for which he was committed to a state psychiatric facility as a teenager, an experience that did little to rehabilitate him and instead provided him with a deeper understanding of the limitations of the mental health system. After marrying and fathering children, Hansen moved to Anchorage, Alaska, in the late 1960s, seeking a fresh start in the rugged, sparsely populated territory. To those who knew him in Anchorage, Hansen was a model of unremarkable normalcy, a quiet, introverted man who worked diligently at his bakery, was an active member of a local hunting club, and attended church with his family. However, beneath this meticulously crafted facade of domesticity, Hansen was nursing a dark and violent fantasy life, fueled by a deep-seated hatred of women and a growing obsession with the power dynamics of hunting. Hansen was an avid and highly skilled outdoorsman, possessing an intimate knowledge of the Alaskan wilderness, bush piloting, and the use of firearms, skills that he would eventually weaponize in the most grotesque manner imaginable. Hansen's criminal career in Alaska began with a series of sexual assaults in the early 1970s, crimes for which he was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to a relatively short prison term. Upon his release, Hansen appeared to temporarily curb his violent impulses, but the underlying psychopathy remained intact, and by 1979, he had evolved from a sexual predator to a calculated serial killer. Hansen's modus operandi was chillingly effective and uniquely adapted to the environment of Anchorage, a city that during the 1970s and 1980s experienced a massive economic boom driven by the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, a boom that brought thousands of transient workers, money, and a thriving, largely unregulated sex trade to the otherwise isolated northern city. Hansen specifically targeted the vulnerable women who worked as prostitutes and exotic dancers in the seedy bars and streets of downtown Anchorage, individuals he knew would not be immediately missed by the mainstream society, and whose disappearances law enforcement was historically less inclined to aggressively investigate. Hansen would frequent the bars along 4th Avenue, quietly observing the women, selecting his victims with a predatory patience before approaching them and offering money for their services. Once a victim was inside his vehicle, Hansen would drive to a remote location, often his own home, where he would subdue, sexually assault, and then murder them. The truly unique and horrifying aspect of Hansen's crimes, the element that distinguished him from almost any other serial killer in history, was what he did with the bodies afterward. Utilizing his skills as a bush pilot and his access to a private aircraft, a Piper Super Cub, Hansen would load the bodies of his victims into his plane, fly deep into the remote, trackless wilderness of the Alaskan interior, and release them into the wild. However, Hansen did not simply dump the bodies. He turned their final moments into a twisted extension of his hunting hobby. Investigators would later discover that Hansen would occasionally give his victims a head start, releasing them into the dense Alaskan bush before hunting them down with a high-powered rifle, as if they were wild game. This horrifying fusion of sexual violence and the sport of hunting earned Hansen the monikers the Butcher Baker and the Alaska Bush Strangler. Following the murder, Hansen would bury the bodies in shallow graves in the remote wilderness, confident that the vastness and brutality of the Alaskan environment would forever conceal his atrocities. For years, Hansen operated with terrifying impunity, as the disappearances of the women he targeted were largely treated by the Anchorage Police Department as isolated incidents, the unfortunate but expected consequences of a transient, high-risk lifestyle. The investigation into what would eventually be recognized as a serial murder case was painfully slow to coalesce, hampered by a lack of physical evidence, the immense geographic area involved, and a systemic bias against the victims. The turning point in the case came in the fall of 1983, when a 17-year-old prostitute named Cindy Paulson escaped from Hansen's custody in a manner that can only be described as miraculous. Hansen had picked up Paulson in downtown Anchorage, driven her to his home, and chained her to a post in his basement with a makeshift collar, preparing to assault and murder her. However, while Hansen was momentarily distracted, Paulson managed to break free from her bindings and flee the house, running into the street where she flagged down a passing motorist who transported her to a police station. Paulson provided investigators with a remarkably detailed description of her attacker, his home, his vehicle, and the distinctive handcuffs and collar he had used to restrain her. Based on her description, detectives were able to identify Robert Hansen as the primary suspect. When detectives confronted Hansen, he denied the allegations, claiming that Paulson was a lying prostitute who had attempted to rob him, and that he had simply driven her back to town. Despite Paulson's credible and detailed testimony, the Anchorage Police Department was initially hesitant to pursue charges against Hansen, a reluctance that was deeply rooted in the institutional bias against sex workers and the belief that a conviction would be difficult to secure in a he said, she said scenario. However, a young, tenacious detective named Glenn Flothe, who was assigned to the Alaska State Troopers' newly formed Major Crimes Unit, refused to let the case drop. Flothe believed Paulson and suspected that Hansen was connected to a much larger pattern of disappearances. Flothe began meticulously mapping the locations where the bodies of several missing women had been discovered in the remote wilderness surrounding Anchorage. A task that required him to utilize his own bush flying skills and coordinate with experienced local pilots. As Flothe plotted the recovery sites on a map, a chilling pattern emerged. The locations formed a precise, geometric cluster around a specific area of the Nick River Valley, a region that Hansen was known to frequent for hunting and that was easily accessible by the type of light aircraft Hansen owned. This geographic profiling was a revolutionary investigative technique at the time and provided the first concrete, analytical link between the disparate disappearances and Robert Hansen. Armed with the geographic profile and Paulson's testimony, Flothe secured a search warrant for Hansen's home and aircraft. The search yielded a treasure trove of incriminating evidence, including an extensive collection of firearms, a cache of jewelry that matched descriptions of items owned by several of the missing women, and most critically, a small aviation map hidden in Hansen's plane that contained a series of small, hand-drawn, X marks. When investigators compared the locations of the X marks on Hansen's map to the locations where the bodies of the missing women had been found, they discovered a perfect, undeniable match, a map to the graves that Hansen had created for his own twisted satisfaction. Confronted with the overwhelming physical evidence, including the map and the jewelry, Robert Hansen's facade of normalcy finally shattered, and he agreed to speak with investigators. During a lengthy interrogation, Hansen confessed to the murders, providing detectives with a detailed account of his crimes and leading them, via helicopter, to the remote grave sites of several previously undiscovered victims. In 1984, Robert Hansen was tried in an Anchorage courtroom, facing charges for the murders of 4 of the women whose bodies had been recovered. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Victor Carlson, presented a devastating case built upon the geographic profile, the map, the jewelry, the aviation records placing Hansen's plane in the vicinity of the dump sites on the dates the women disappeared, and the powerful testimony of Cindy Paulson. Hansen's defense attorney attempted to undermine Paulson's credibility and challenge the admissibility of the map, but the evidence against Hansen was simply too overwhelming to overcome. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before finding Hansen guilty on all counts. The judge, recognizing the extreme danger Hansen posed to society and the calculated, predatory nature of his crimes, sentenced him to an astonishing 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The broader implications of the Robert Hansen case were profound and far-reaching, exposing the devastating consequences of societal apathy toward the victimization of marginalized women, and highlighting the critical importance of geographic profiling in the investigation of serial crimes. Hansen's ability to operate for over a decade was directly facilitated by a law enforcement culture that viewed the disappearances of prostitutes as low-priority cases, a bias that allowed a predator to exploit the vulnerabilities of his victims with virtual impunity. The case forced the Anchorage Police Department and law enforcement agencies across the country to reevaluate their protocols for investigating missing persons cases, particularly those involving individuals engaged in high-risk lifestyles, leading to the development of more victim-centered investigative approaches. Furthermore, the pioneering geographic profiling work conducted by Glenn Flothe, which demonstrated that the spatial behavior of a serial offender could be analyzed and predicted, became a foundational element of modern criminal profiling, influencing the methodologies utilized by the FBI and international law enforcement agencies to this day. Robert Hansen spent the remainder of his life in maximum security confinement, primarily at the Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska, a facility surrounded by the very wilderness he had used as his killing field. Unlike many serial killers who seek notoriety or public attention, Hansen lived out his final decades in relative obscurity, a quiet, unremarkable prisoner who rarely granted interviews and expressed no public remorse for the lives he had taken. On August 21, 2014, Robert Hansen died at the age of 75 from natural causes while still in custody, a quiet end for a man who had caused so much terror and suffering. The impact of Hanson's crimes on the families of his victims and the Anchorage community was profound and enduring, as the vast, beautiful Alaskan wilderness, once a source of pride and livelihood, was forever tainted by the knowledge that it held the secrets of a monster. The case of Robert Hanson serves as a grim and powerful reminder that evil can flourish in the most isolated and unexpected places, hidden behind the most ordinary of facades, and that the true measure of a society's justice system is not how it protects the powerful, but how rigorously it seeks justice for the most vulnerable among us. Number 7. Altemio Clemente Sanchez, a man who successfully concealed a horrific double life behind the facade of a stable marriage, a steady job, and an active involvement in his community, terrorized the Buffalo, New York, area for over 2 decades as a serial rapist and murderer known to the terrified public as the Bike Path Rapist and the Bike Path Killer. Born on January 19, 1951, in Puerto Rico, Sanchez relocated with his family to the United States, eventually settling in the Buffalo area where he would spend the entirety of his adult life. To the outside world, Sanchez was the embodiment of a quiet, unassuming family man, a dedicated husband who raised 3 sons, a practicing Catholic who attended church regularly, and a reliable employee who worked for over 30 years as a machinist at a local manufacturing plant, Cheektowaga-based American Axle and Manufacturing. He was known to his neighbors as a helpful, polite individual who kept his property immaculate and showed no outward signs of the monstrous violence that simmered beneath his carefully constructed exterior. However, the reality of Altemio Sanchez was far darker, a reality that involved a compulsive, predatory need to exert absolute power and control over women, a need that he first acted upon in the early 1980s and continued to satiate with terrifying regularity for more than 20 years. Sanchez's criminal career began in 1981, when he embarked on a campaign of sexual violence that would eventually encompass at least 14 confirmed rapes and 3 brutal murders, a campaign that earned him his infamous moniker due to his preferred hunting ground, the network of secluded biking and walking paths that crisscrossed the parks and river corridors of the Buffalo metropolitan area, particularly the area surrounding the Ellicott Creek Bike Path in Amherst and Tonawanda. Sanchez's methodology was characterized by a chilling consistency and a predatory patience that allowed him to evade capture for an extraordinarily long period. He would typically stalk his victims along the bike paths, selecting women who were alone, often joggers or students, who were using the paths during the early morning or late evening hours when the areas were isolated and poorly lit. Armed with a knife or other makeshift weapon, Sanchez would ambush his victims, dragging them off the path into the dense underbrush where he would sexually assault them at knife point. Following the attacks, Sanchez would meticulously instruct his victims to remain quiet and not look at him, a command driven by a profound, almost obsessive fear of being identified. He would then flee the scene on foot or on a bicycle, disappearing into the surrounding neighborhoods before police could respond. For years, the Bike Path Rapist was a phantom, a shadowy presence that instilled a deep-seated fear in the women of the Buffalo suburbs, leading to a significant drop in the use of the park system and a pervasive sense of vulnerability among female residents. The investigation into the Bike Path Rapist attacks was a frustrating, decades-long endeavor for local law enforcement, involving multiple police jurisdictions, including the Amherst Police Department, the Tonawanda Police Department, and the New York State Police, all of whom were dealing with a suspect who left behind remarkably little physical evidence. Despite the establishment of dedicated task forces, the use of undercover female officers as decoys, and the administration of hundreds of polygraph tests to potential suspects, the investigation was repeatedly stymied by the limitations of forensic science at the time and the killer's extreme caution. The case took a dark and tragic turn in September 1990, when the Bike Path Rapist crossed the ultimate threshold from sexual violence to murder, killing a 16-year-old high school student named Karen Majewski. Majewski had been jogging on a bike path in the village of Sloan when she was attacked, strangled, and left partially clothed in a wooded area. While the murder bore striking similarities to the modus operandi of the Bike Path Rapist, the lack of definitive physical evidence linking the homicide to the prior rapes created enough ambiguity to prevent investigators from conclusively merging the cases. This devastating pattern repeated itself in 2006, when a 45-year-old woman named Joan Diver disappeared while riding her bike on a path in Newstead, New York. Her body was discovered days later in a wooded area, strangled to death. The murder of Joan Diver, coming 16 years after the Maevsky homicide, ignited a massive, renewed investigative effort, as police finally, definitively linked the two murders and the series of bike path rapes through advanced behavioral analysis and a re-examination of the scant physical evidence that had been painstakingly preserved over the decades. The turning point in the decades-long hunt for the bike path rapist and killer finally arrived through the revolutionary application of DNA technology, a scientific advancement that would ultimately pierce through the veil of anonymity Altemio Sanchez had maintained for over 25 years. In the early 2000s, investigators from the Amherst Police Department, working in conjunction with the New York State Police Forensic Laboratory, made the decision to resubmit the biological evidence recovered from several of the earliest rape victims to modern DNA sequencing platforms. The original investigations in the 1980s had yielded no usable DNA profiles, as the technology required to extract and analyze the minute amounts of genetic material left by the attacker simply did not exist at the time. However, the new testing yielded a breakthrough, generating a complete, highly specific DNA profile of the bike path rapist. With the profile in hand, investigators executed a strategy that was both highly aggressive and ethically complex: a massive, clandestine DNA dragnet. Suspecting that the offender was likely a local resident who was familiar with the bike path system, investigators began surreptitiously collecting DNA samples from individuals who had been identified as persons of interest during the original investigations, obtaining the samples from discarded items like coffee cups, cigarette butts, and gum. Over a period of several years, hundreds of samples were collected and tested against the bike path rapist profile, a painstaking and often frustrating process that yielded nothing but exclusions. Simultaneously, investigators uploaded the DNA profile to the Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS, the national DNA database maintained by the FBI, hoping for a direct hit from a convicted offender. The CODIS system initially yielded no matches, as Sanchez had never been convicted of a crime that would have required him to submit a DNA sample. However, the investigative team, led by Detective Chief Dennis Benkskowski of the Amherst Police, refused to give up, and their persistence finally paid off in a remarkably indirect fashion. In late 2006, investigators received a tip from a parole officer who was monitoring a different individual, a man who had been convicted of a minor sex crime and was a person of interest in the bike path case. While the suspect's DNA did not match the bike path rapist profile, the investigation into his background led detectives to discover that he had a close association with Altemio Sanchez, a connection that placed Sanchez on the radar of the task force for the first time. Utilizing the same surreptitious collection techniques they had perfected over years, investigators obtained a DNA sample from Sanchez without his knowledge, swabbing a discarded cup he had used at a local restaurant. The sample was rushed to the state police laboratory, and within days, the results came back with absolute, irrefutable certainty. The DNA from the discarded cup was a perfect, identical match to the biological evidence recovered from the bike path rapist crime scenes spanning back to 1981. On January 15, 2007, a team of heavily armed officers descended upon the modest home in Cheektowaga where Altemio Sanchez had lived with his wife for nearly 30 years. Sanchez was arrested without incident, and a subsequent search of his residence and vehicle yielded additional corroborating evidence, including items consistent with those used in the attacks. The arrest of Altemio Sanchez sent a shockwave of disbelief through the Buffalo community, as the quiet, unassuming machinist was revealed to be the monster who had haunted the region's bike paths for a generation. The legal proceedings against Sanchez were complex, as they involved crimes committed across multiple jurisdictions over a span of more than 2 decades. To avoid the trauma of multiple trials and the potential for a death penalty sentence in the federal system, Sanchez's defense attorneys engaged in extensive plea negotiations with prosecutors from Erie County. In May 2007, Altemio Sanchez formally pleaded guilty in an Erie County courtroom to the murders of Joan Diver and Karen Majewski, as well as to charges related to 3 of the bike path rapes, as part of a comprehensive plea agreement. In exchange for his guilty plea and his agreement to provide a detailed confession, prosecutors agreed to a sentence of 75 years to life in state prison, effectively ensuring that Sanchez would die behind bars. During the sentencing hearing, Sanchez offered a brief, rambling apology, claiming that he did not know why he had committed the crimes, a statement that was met with audible anger and disbelief by the packed courtroom, which included the families of the murdered women and survivors of his rapes. The judge, condemning Sanchez for the sheer duration and devastation of his crimes, imposed the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement. The broader implications of the Altemio Sanchez case are profound and multifaceted, highlighting both the incredible power of modern forensic science and the critical, often overlooked vulnerabilities in how law enforcement investigates serial sexual predators. The fact that Sanchez was able to operate for over 25 years, raping at least 14 women and murdering 3, was a catastrophic failure that was directly attributable to the limitations of pre-DNA forensic technology and a lack of cohesive, cross-jurisdictional information sharing. The case demonstrated that serial rapists are often highly adaptable, calculating offenders who can successfully integrate into society and maintain a facade of absolute normalcy for decades, evading detection not through brilliance, but through a compulsive attention to detail and a deep understanding of the investigative blind spots of the justice system. Furthermore, the case exposed the devastating, lifelong impact of sexual trauma, as the survivors of Sanchez's attacks, many of whom had lived in silent fear for over 2 decades, were finally able to confront their attacker and receive a measure of validation and closure that had been denied to them for a quarter of a century. The investigative strategy employed to capture Sanchez, specifically the massive, covert DNA dragnet, also sparked a significant ethical and legal debate regarding the boundaries of search and seizure protections under the Fourth Amendment, a debate that continues to this day as law enforcement agencies increasingly utilize surreptitious DNA collection techniques to solve cold cases. Altemio Sanchez is currently incarcerated at the Mohawk Correctional Facility in Rome, New York, where he is serving his 75-year-to-life sentence. He has been denied parole and is not eligible for release until he is well over 100 years old. The impact of his crimes on the Buffalo community is an enduring scar, a transformation of the region's park and bike path systems from places of recreation and tranquility into landscapes associated with terror and loss, a legacy that serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous predators are often not the monsters hiding in the dark, but the ordinary neighbors living quietly in the light. Number 8. Larry William Eyler, a man who terrorized the American Midwest throughout the early 1980s with a horrific campaign of abduction, sexual torture, and murder that claimed the lives of at least 21 young men and boys, earning him the chilling moniker of the Highway Killer, a title that reflected both his predatory hunting grounds along the interstate highways of Indiana and Illinois and the transient, rootless nature of his existence. Born on December 21, 1952, in Crawfordsville, Indiana, Larry Eyler was the product of a profoundly dysfunctional and deeply traumatic childhood that laid the psychological groundwork for the extreme violence he would later unleash. Abandoned by his biological father shortly after birth, Eyler was raised by his mother and a succession of abusive stepfathers, one of whom subjected him to severe physical beatings and psychological torment. This environment of instability and violence was compounded by the painful reality of Eyler's emerging homosexuality during a time when such orientations were heavily stigmatized and socially ostracized, particularly in the conservative, rural communities of the Midwest. As a teenager, Eyler struggled profoundly with his sexual identity, leading to feelings of intense self-loathing, confusion, and a deep-seated rage that he internalized for years. Despite these internal struggles, Eyler managed to present a relatively normal exterior, graduating from high school and briefly attending college before moving to the Indianapolis area, where he worked a series of menial jobs, including stints as a carpenter and a landscape gardener. Physically, Eyler was an imposing figure, a large, muscular man with a rugged appearance that allowed him to project an aura of strength and confidence, a facade that masked the deeply fractured, violent psyche lurking beneath the surface. It was in the gay bars and cruising areas of Indianapolis and Chicago that Eyler found the environment where his internal rage and his sexual desires fused into a lethal, uncontrollable compulsion. By the early 1980s, Eyler had begun to frequent the vibrant but often dangerous underground gay scenes of the Midwest, a subculture that existed in the shadows of the cities and along the desolate stretches of the interstate highway system, areas known as cruising grounds where anonymous sexual encounters could be arranged. Eyler's modus operandi was chillingly efficient and heavily reliant on the social dynamics of this underground world, as he would typically pick up young men, many of whom were runaways, prostitutes, or simply individuals looking for a ride or a good time, at gay bars, bus stations, or highway rest stops. He would offer them money, drugs, or a lift in his distinctive vehicle, usually a pickup truck or a van, and once they were isolated, the horrific violence would begin. Eyler would drive his victims to remote, rural areas, often wooded spots or abandoned properties near the highways, where he would restrain them using rope, handcuffs, or duct tape. What followed was a prolonged, sadistic ordeal of sexual torture, during which Eyler would beat, stab, and mutilate his victims, inflicting an almost incomprehensible level of physical trauma. The autopsy reports of Eyler's victims revealed a level of extreme overkill, with bodies bearing dozens, sometimes over 100, stab wounds, indicating a frenzied, uncontrollable rage that completely consumed him during the acts. Following the murders, Eyler would dispose of the bodies in a variety of locations, including ditches, fields, and dumpsters, often discarding them along the very highway corridors where he had picked them up. The investigation into Larry Eyler's crimes was a chaotic and frustrating endeavor that was severely hampered by the jurisdictional boundaries of the Midwest, as his victims were discovered across a vast geographic area spanning multiple counties in Indiana and Illinois, with bodies turning up in locations ranging from rural farm counties to the outskirts of major cities like Chicago. In the early 1980s, law enforcement agencies in different jurisdictions did not possess the communication infrastructure or the analytical tools necessary to quickly recognize that the disparate, mutilated bodies turning up in their areas were the work of a single, highly mobile serial killer. Furthermore, the fact that the victims were predominantly homosexual men and prostitutes, demographics that were heavily marginalized and largely ignored by both society and law enforcement at the time, meant that the initial investigations lacked the urgency and resource allocation typically afforded to cases involving more traditional victims. It was not until the sheer volume of bodies became impossible to ignore that a broader pattern began to emerge, and even then, the investigation was plagued by a deep-seated reluctance within many police departments to publicly acknowledge the existence of a serial killer targeting gay men, a reluctance born out of a combination of homophobia, political pressure, and a genuine lack of understanding of the subculture in which the killer was operating. The turning point in the Eyler investigation came in the fall of 1983, when a series of fortuitous breaks and a courageous victim finally provided law enforcement with the tangible link they needed to identify the highway killer. In October 1983, a young man managed to escape from Eyler's vehicle after being picked up in Chicago and driven to a remote area in Indiana where Eyler attempted to attack him. The victim fought back fiercely, causing Eyler to flee, and the victim was able to provide police with a detailed description of the attacker, and critically, a partial license plate number of the vehicle. Simultaneously, detectives in Lake County, Indiana, who had been investigating the discovery of several mutilated bodies in their jurisdiction, had compiled a list of persons of interest based on witness statements from gay bars in the area, and Larry Eyler's name had surfaced as an individual who had been seen in the company of several of the victims prior to their disappearances. Armed with the survivor's description and the license plate information, investigators were able to positively identify Larry Eyler as the prime suspect in the highway killer case. In a move that would later become the subject of intense controversy and legal scrutiny, investigators in Lake County, led by a highly aggressive prosecutor named Christopher Toth, attempted to build an airtight case against Eyler by utilizing a cooperative witness, a man named John Dobrovolskis, who was a former acquaintance of Eyler's and who agreed to wear a wire and engage Eyler in conversations about the murders. During these recorded conversations, Eyler made a series of highly incriminating statements, discussing the locations of bodies and the details of the crimes in a manner that clearly indicated his guilt, although he stopped short of making a direct, legally admissible confession. Based on the wiretap evidence, the survivor's testimony, and the circumstantial evidence linking Eiler to the victims, he was arrested in October 1983 and charged with the murder of a young man named Stephen Agan, whose body had been found in a ditch in Indiana. However, the legal proceedings against Larry Eiler were immediately derailed by a series of catastrophic prosecutorial missteps that allowed a killer to slip through the fingers of the justice system. During the pretrial phase, it was revealed that Prosecutor Toth had engaged in a highly unethical and illegal maneuver, effectively hiding a key witness. A young man who claimed to have witnessed Eiler committing a murder, from the defense team in order to use the witness in a future trial in a different jurisdiction. When the judge discovered this blatant violation of Brady disclosure requirements, which mandate that prosecutors share all exculpatory and material evidence with the defense, the judge was forced to dismiss the charges against Eiler with prejudice, a devastating blow to the investigation that allowed Eiler to walk out of jail a free man in 1985. The dismissal of the charges was a profound and deeply frustrating failure of the criminal justice system, a failure that was directly attributable to the overzealous and unethical tactics of a prosecutor who was more concerned with securing a conviction than with upholding the rule of law. For a brief, terrifying period following his release, Larry Eiler was a free man, and the killings immediately resumed, as he proceeded to murder several more young men in the Chicago area, a gruesome testament to the absolute failure of the system to protect the public from a known, highly dangerous predator. However, Eiler's renewed freedom was short-lived, as investigators in Illinois, who had been building their own case against him separate from the tainted Indiana investigation, were meticulously preparing to strike. In September 1986, Eiler was arrested by police in Chicago and charged with the murder and dismemberment of a 15-year-old boy named Daniel Bridges, whose remains had been discovered in a dumpster on the city's north side. The evidence in the Bridges case was overwhelming and entirely untainted by the ethical violations that had plagued the Indiana prosecution, as forensic technicians had recovered Eiler's fingerprints from the plastic bags used to dispose of the body, and a witness had seen Eiler with the victim on the night of the murder. In 1986, Larry Eiler was tried in a Cook County, Illinois, courtroom for the murder of Daniel Bridges. The prosecution presented a devastating case built upon the forensic evidence, the eyewitness testimony, and the earlier wiretap recordings from the Indiana investigation, which the judge allowed to be admitted to demonstrate Eiler's motive and intent. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before finding Eiler guilty of first-degree murder, and he was subsequently sentenced to death by lethal injection. Following his conviction, Eiler was transferred to death row at the Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, where he spent the next several years embroiled in a seemingly endless series of appeals. During his time on death row, Eiler underwent a remarkable and highly controversial transformation, as he began to correspond with a prominent defense attorney named Kathleen Zellner, a lawyer known for her aggressive advocacy on behalf of wrongful conviction cases. Under Zellner's guidance, Eiler composed a detailed, 30-page written confession in which he admitted to the murders of 21 young men, providing specific, verifiable details about the crimes and the locations of the bodies that had never been released to the public. This confession, while providing a measure of closure to the families of the victims, was a highly strategic legal maneuver designed to bolster Eiler's appeals by demonstrating a willingness to cooperate with authorities and to highlight the systemic failures, specifically the unethical behavior of the Indiana prosecutor, that had allowed him to kill for so long. In 1994, as his execution date approached, Illinois Governor Jim Edgar commuted Eiler's death sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a decision that was met with outrage by the victims' families, but was legally justified by the procedural irregularities that had tainted the original prosecution. However, Eiler's reprieve was extraordinarily short-lived, as he died from complications related to AIDS in March 1994, just a few months after his sentence was commuted. The broader implications of the Larry Eiler case are profound and deeply unsettling, exposing the catastrophic consequences of a criminal justice system that allows homophobia, jurisdictional fragmentation, and prosecutorial misconduct to obstruct the pursuit of justice. The fact that Eiler was able to murder over 20 young men over a period of several years was a direct result of the societal indifference to the victimization of gay men and prostitutes, a demographic that was effectively deemed expendable by the very institutions sworn to protect them. The case also served as a stark and cautionary tale about the dangers of prosecutorial overreach, as the unethical actions of a single prosecutor in Indiana directly resulted in the dismissal of charges against a known serial killer and the subsequent murders of additional innocent victims. Furthermore, the Eiler case highlighted the unique investigative challenges posed by highly mobile offenders who operate across state lines, a challenge that ultimately contributed to the expansion of federal law enforcement involvement in serial murder investigations through mechanisms like the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. Larry Eiler was buried in an unmarked grave in Indiana, a quiet and unceremonious end for a man who caused so much pain and terror, a final footnote in a case that remains a powerful and disturbing reminder of the devastating human cost of systemic bias and institutional failure. Number 9. Carl Eugene Watts, a man who was officially linked through confessions to the brutal murders of at least 22 women across 3 states over an 8-year period, and who is suspected by law enforcement of having killed dozens more, earning him the terrifying monikers the Sunday Morning Slasher and the Coral Gables Killer. Was a predator of unparalleled stealth who exploited the racial and societal fault lines of late 20th century America to evade capture for decades. Born on November 7, 1953, in Killeen, Texas, Carl Watts exhibited deeply disturbed and violent behavior from a remarkably early age, presenting a clinical profile that baffled the psychiatric professionals who attempted to treat him throughout his youth. As a child, Watts was plagued by severe, violent hallucinations, claiming to see ghosts and demons that tormented him and commanded him to act out against others, particularly women. He exhibited a disturbing fascination with death and violence, torturing and killing neighborhood pets, and demonstrating a complete absence of empathy or remorse for his actions. His mother, desperately trying to manage her deeply disturbed son, submitted him to extensive psychiatric evaluations, resulting in diagnoses ranging from schizophrenia to severe antisocial personality disorder. However, the psychiatric interventions of the 1960s and 1970s were largely inadequate for dealing with a child of Watts's profound psychopathology, and he was routinely released back into the community, a pattern of institutional failure that would have deadly consequences for decades to come. As Watts entered adulthood, his internal violent urges coalesced into a specific, compulsive fixation on women, whom he viewed not as human beings, but as demonic entities that needed to be exterminated in order to silence the voices in his head. Watts's criminal career began in the Houston, Texas, area in the early 1970s, primarily targeting young women who lived in apartment complexes near his own residences. His methodology was characterized by a terrifying speed and brutality that left investigators stunned and baffled. Unlike many serial killers who meticulously plan their attacks and establish elaborate rituals, Watts operated with an almost impulsive ferocity, simply walking up to the doors of his victims, forcing his way inside, and launching into a violent, frenzied assault. His weapon of choice was typically a knife, but he also used blunt objects, scissors, and whatever was readily available, stabbing, bludgeoning, and strangling his victims to death in a matter of minutes. Following the murder, Watts would frequently stage the bodies or leave them in grotesque poses. But unlike killers who returned to their crime scenes to relive the experience, Watts seemed to view the act of killing as a utilitarian exorcism, a task that needed to be completed and then immediately forgotten. The speed and lack of premeditation in Watts's attacks made him an incredibly difficult target for law enforcement, as he left behind very little in the way of traditional forensic evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, and no clear motive that investigators could use to establish a behavioral profile. Throughout the 1970s, the bodies of young women continued to pile up in Houston, but the Houston Police Department, overwhelmed by a surging homicide rate and constrained by limited resources, failed to recognize that a single serial killer was responsible for a significant portion of the carnage. The investigation was further hampered by a devastating institutional blind spot: the fact that Watts primarily targeted African American women, a demographic whose victimization was systematically deprioritized by a police department and a broader society that viewed the deaths of poor black women as an unfortunate but expected consequence of urban life. In 1981, Watts's methodology underwent a terrifying and highly unusual evolution when he abruptly relocated from Texas to the Detroit, Michigan, area, a move prompted by his suspicion that police in Houston were closing in on him. In Detroit, Watts continued his campaign of violence with undiminished ferocity, but he adapted his approach to the new environment, shifting his hunting grounds from apartment complexes to the residential streets of suburban neighborhoods. It was in Michigan that he earned the moniker the Sunday Morning Slasher, as several of his attacks occurred in the early morning hours on Sundays, when his victims were alone or preparing for the day. Michigan authorities, like their counterparts in Texas, initially failed to connect the string of brutal murders to a single perpetrator, viewing them as isolated incidents of domestic violence or random acts of violence. The investigation in Detroit was further complicated by the fact that Watts was not committing sexual assaults, a deviation from the typical serial killer profile that confused investigators and delayed the recognition of a pattern. Watts's ability to operate across state lines with such devastating effectiveness exposed the severe limitations of interstate law enforcement communication in the pre-digital era, as critical information about the Texas murders was not effectively shared with Michigan detectives, allowing Watts to exploit the jurisdictional void. Following a brief but lethal stint in Michigan, Watts moved again, this time to the Coral Gables area of South Florida in 1982, where he continued to murder women before eventually drifting back to Texas. The turning point in the decades-long hunt for Carl Watts finally arrived not through a brilliant investigative breakthrough, but through a combination of sheer luck and a rare moment of victim resilience. On May 23, 1982, in Houston, Texas, Watts attempted to murder a young woman named Lori Lister and her roommate as they entered their apartment. Watts attacked Lister, stabbing her repeatedly, but she fought back with a ferocity and determination that completely disrupted his carefully honed, impulsive attack pattern. In the ensuing struggle, Lister managed to break free and scream for help, causing Watts to flee the scene. A neighbor heard the screams and witnessed Watts running from the apartment, providing police with a description of the attacker and, critically, a partial license plate number of the vehicle he was driving. Using the partial plate, Houston police were able to track the vehicle to Carl Watts, who was brought in for questioning. When confronted by detectives, Watts, who had never before been subjected to a sustained, focused police interrogation, exhibited a bizarre and highly contradictory demeanor. He alternated between complete silence, childlike evasiveness, and sudden, unprompted outbursts of violence against the interviewing officers, at one point grabbing a pair of scissors and lunging at a detective. However, the critical break in the interrogation came when Watts, seemingly exhausted by the psychological pressure, offered to tell the police about the women he had killed if they would simply stop asking him questions. In a stunning and highly unconventional move, Houston police agreed to Watts's terms, and over the course of several hours, Watts provided detectives with a chillingly calm, detailed account of his murder spree, confessing to the killings of 12 women in Texas and providing specific, verifiable details about the crimes that had never been released to the public. He led investigators to the locations of previously unknown bodies and described the methods he had used to kill each victim with a detached, mechanical precision that deeply disturbed the veteran detectives. However, the legal ramifications of this confession were immediately and severely complicated by the manner in which it was obtained, as the Houston police had failed to properly Mirandize Watts prior to the interrogation, a catastrophic procedural error that rendered the confession legally inadmissible in court. Faced with the prospect of losing the confession and having no other usable physical evidence to tie Watts to the majority of the murders, prosecutors in Texas were forced into an agonizingly difficult decision. In a plea bargain that remains one of the most controversial in American criminal history, Carl Watts was allowed to plead guilty to a single count of burglary with intent to commit murder in exchange for a 60-year sentence. He was not charged with a single murder in Texas, a decision that was fiercely criticized by the victims' families and the public, but was defended by prosecutors who argued that without the confession, They had absolutely no admissible evidence to convict him, and that the plea deal at least ensured he would be removed from society for a significant period. The broader implications of the Carl Watts case are profound and deeply disturbing, exposing the catastrophic failures of a criminal justice system that was systematically unequipped to identify, track, and prosecute a highly mobile, cross-jurisdictional serial killer who targeted marginalized victims. The fact that Watts was able to murder at least 22 women, and potentially many more, across 3 states over 8 years was a direct result of the institutional racism that devalued the lives of his primarily African American victims, the jurisdictional fragmentation that prevented the sharing of critical intelligence between police departments in different states, and the severe limitations of forensic science in an era before DNA profiling. Furthermore, the case highlighted the devastating consequences of procedural errors by law enforcement, as the failure to Mirandize Watts prior to his confession resulted in a plea deal that denied justice and closure to the vast majority of his victims' families. However, the story of Carl Watts did not end with the controversial Texas plea deal. In 2004, following the development of advanced DNA technology, investigators in Michigan were able to link Watts to the murders of 2 women in the Detroit area through biological evidence recovered from the crime scenes. Michigan authorities immediately extradited Watts from the Texas prison system to stand trial for the 1979 murder of Helen Dutcher, a 17-year-old girl who had been stabbed to death in a suburb of Detroit. Faced with the overwhelming weight of the DNA evidence, Watts pleaded guilty to the murder in 2004 and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Michigan conviction was a bittersweet victory for the victims' families, a belated acknowledgement of Watts's guilt that came over 2 decades after his original confession had been discarded on a technicality. Carl Watts died on September 21, 2007, at the age of 53, while serving his life sentence in a Michigan prison, succumbing to complications from prostate cancer. He took his secrets to the grave, never officially confessing to the full extent of his murder spree, which some criminologists and law enforcement officials estimate may have exceeded 50 victims. The impact of Carl Watts's crimes on the communities he terrorized in Texas, Michigan, and Florida is an enduring legacy of grief and systemic failure, a grim and powerful reminder that the true measure of a society's commitment to justice is revealed not in how it protects the privileged, but in how rigorously and relentlessly it seeks the truth for the most vulnerable and marginalized among us. Number 10. Randy Stephen Kraft, a highly intelligent, soft-spoken computer consultant who meticulously maintained a coded list of his victims that would later be described by investigators as his scorecard, was convicted of murdering 16 young men and boys in California, Oregon, and Michigan between 1972 and 1983, and is strongly suspected by law enforcement of having killed as many as 67 individuals, a staggering victim count that would place him among the most prolific serial killers in American history. Born on March 19, 1945, in Long Beach, California, Randy Kraft grew up in a seemingly stable, middle-class suburban environment that offered no outward indication of the extreme, predatory violence that lay dormant within him. A bright, academically gifted student, Kraft excelled in school, attended local community colleges, and eventually earned a degree from California State University, Long Beach, positioning himself for a successful career in the emerging field of information technology. To those who knew him, Kraft was the embodiment of the clean-cut, polite, and professional young American male, a man who drove a nice car, maintained a neat appearance, and exhibited a quiet, unassuming demeanor that inspired trust and confidence. He served briefly in the United States Air Force before receiving a hardship discharge, and he subsequently settled into a comfortable, albeit secretive, life in the Southern California suburbs, working as a computer consultant for various aerospace and technology firms. Beneath this meticulously crafted facade of normalcy, however, Randy Kraft was nursing a dark, compulsive, and increasingly lethal sexual addiction that targeted young men, particularly hitchhikers, military personnel, and runaway teenagers, demographics he knew were transient, vulnerable, and less likely to be immediately missed by the structures of mainstream society. Kraft's criminal career is believed to have begun in the early 1970s, a period that coincided with the rise of the American highway system as a primary means of youth travel and the corresponding emergence of a vast, mobile population of vulnerable young men moving along the Pacific coast. Kraft's modus operandi was chillingly effective and heavily reliant on his ability to project an aura of absolute harmlessness. He would typically drive his vehicle along the major highways and boulevards of Southern California, particularly the stretches of Pacific Coast Highway and the freeways adjacent to military bases like Camp Pendleton and the Long Beach Naval Station. When he spotted a young man hitchhiking or walking alone at night, Kraft would pull over and offer a ride, an offer that was almost universally accepted by individuals who saw nothing threatening in the polite, well-dressed driver. Once the victim was inside the vehicle, Kraft would typically engage them in casual conversation, often offering them alcohol that he had pre-laced with high doses of sedatives, such as flurazepam or chlorpromazine. As the drugs took effect, the victim would quickly lose consciousness, rendering them completely helpless and at the mercy of a predator whose true nature was about to be revealed. Unlike serial killers who were driven by a need for immediate, violent confrontation, Kraft derived his pleasure from the absolute control he exerted over his comatose victims, subjecting them to prolonged, systematic sexual torture and mutilation while they were unconscious or semi-conscious. Following the sexual assault, Kraft would murder his victims, typically through strangulation or asphyxiation, methods that left minimal outward signs of trauma and allowed him to maintain the fiction that the deaths were accidental or drug-related. The true horror of Kraft's crimes, however, was revealed in the extensive, ritualistic post-mortem mutilation he inflicted upon the bodies. Investigators would later discover that Kraft engaged in horrific acts of genital mutilation, frequently inserting foreign objects into the victims' bodies, removing internal organs, and occasionally severing limbs. After the murder and mutilation, Kraft would typically dump the bodies along the highways and rural roads of Southern California, Oregon, and Michigan, often discarding them in plain sight, wrapped in blankets or plastic, a brazen display of confidence that reflected his absolute certainty that he was smarter than the police and would never be caught. For over a decade, Randy Kraft operated with a terrifying degree of impunity, leaving a trail of mutilated corpses across 3 states that confounded and frustrated law enforcement agencies at every level. The investigation into what would eventually be recognized as the work of a single, highly mobile serial killer was a painfully slow and disjointed process, severely hampered by the vast geographic spread of the crime scenes, the transient nature of the victims, and a profound lack of inter-agency communication. In the pre-digital era, a detective in Orange County, California, had no efficient way to compare notes with the detective in Portland, Oregon, or Grand Rapids, Michigan, allowing Kraft to exploit the jurisdictional seams of the American law enforcement system with devastating effectiveness. Furthermore, the victim's status as young, often homosexual or transient men, combined with the fact that many bore signs of heavy drug and alcohol use, led to a pervasive and deeply harmful assumption within many police departments that the deaths were simply the tragic but expected consequences of a high-risk lifestyle. A bias that resulted in inadequate forensic examinations and a failure to recognize the clear patterns of mutilation that linked the cases. The turning point in the Randy Kraft investigation finally arrived in the early morning hours of May 14, 1983, in a manner that was almost comically anticlimactic given the sheer scale and horror of his crimes. 2 California Highway Patrol officers, Michael Pennings and Kevin McDonald, were conducting a routine traffic stop on the Harbor Freeway in Los Angeles when they observed a vehicle weaving erratically across the lanes. The officers pulled the vehicle over and approached the driver, who was identified as Randy Kraft. As the officers spoke with Kraft, they immediately noted that he was exhibiting signs of extreme intoxication, slurring his words and unable to maintain his balance. However, as one of the officers shined his flashlight into the interior of the vehicle, he noticed something far more disturbing than a drunk driver. Slumped in the passenger seat, partially covered by a blanket, was the lifeless body of a young Marine, Terry Lee Gambrill, who had been strangled to death only hours earlier. Kraft was immediately placed under arrest, and the vehicle, a silver Toyota Celica, was impounded and subjected to a meticulous forensic examination. The search of Kraft's vehicle yielded a staggering array of incriminating evidence that provided investigators with their first terrifying glimpse into the mind and methodology of a prolific serial killer. Inside the trunk and the passenger compartment, officers discovered an extensive collection of items that would later be identified as trophies taken from his victims, including wallets, identification cards, driver's licenses, and personal effects belonging to dozens of different young men. They also recovered a cache of weapons, including knives and a rope, as well as a large quantity of sedatives and a camera containing undeveloped film that would later show graphic images of unconscious or deceased victims. However, the single most devastating piece of evidence found in the vehicle was a seemingly innocuous piece of paper, a list of 61 cryptic entries, written in code, that contained dates, locations, and a series of abbreviations and symbols. This document, which would become infamous as the scorecard, was a meticulously maintained ledger of Kraft's murderous career, a chilling record of his victims that he had compiled for his own twisted sense of accomplishment and legacy. The cryptic nature of the scorecard initially baffled investigators, but a team of astute detectives and codebreakers, working tirelessly over the following months, were able to decipher many of the entries, cross-referencing the dates and locations with known murder victims and missing persons reports. The results of the decryption effort were horrifying, as the scorecard appeared to contain the names or identifying details of 45 victims who had been found dead, as well as 16 additional entries that corresponded to young men who were still listed as missing persons, strongly suggesting that Kraft's actual body count was far higher than the 16 murders he was initially charged with. Following his arrest, the legal proceedings against Randy Kraft were among the most complex, protracted, and contentious in California history, reflecting the sheer volume of evidence, the geographic scope of the crimes, and the high-stakes nature of a potential death penalty case. Prosecutors in Orange County, led by Assistant District Attorney Brian Brown, made the strategic decision to try Kraft for the murders that had occurred within their jurisdiction, specifically focusing on a representative sample of 16 victims whose cases were supported by the strongest physical and circumstantial evidence. The trial commenced in the fall of 1988 in a Santa Ana courtroom, presided over by Judge Donald McCartan, and quickly devolved into a grueling, months-long battle of wills between the prosecution and a highly aggressive defense team led by Attorney C. Thomas McDonald. The prosecution's case was built upon a mountain of circumstantial evidence, including the scorecard, the recovered trophies, the photographic evidence, and the damning testimony of the California Highway Patrol officers who had discovered the body in Kraft's car. However, the defense launched a relentless and highly effective attack on the prosecution's forensic evidence, challenging the chain of custody of the items recovered from the vehicle, questioning the reliability of the scorecard decryption, and arguing that the state had failed to produce a single eyewitness, a direct confession, or any physical evidence, such as DNA or fingerprints, that definitively placed Kraft at the specific crime scenes. The defense skillfully exploited the lack of direct forensic links, painting a picture of a flawed, overzealous investigation that had targeted Kraft simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time with a dead body in his car. Despite the defense's vigorous efforts, the sheer weight of the circumstantial evidence, combined with the devastating impact of the scorecard, proved too much for the jury to overcome. After deliberating for several days, the jury found Randy Kraft guilty of 16 counts of first-degree murder, along with multiple special circumstances, including murder during the commission of a sexual assault and multiple murder. In November 1989, Judge McCartan formally sentenced Kraft to death by lethal injection, delivering a scathing rebuke of the defendant and declaring that the scorecard demonstrated a level of evil and depravity that warranted the ultimate penalty. The broader implications of the Randy Kraft case are profound and far-reaching, exposing the catastrophic vulnerabilities of a criminal justice system that was utterly unprepared to deal with a highly intelligent, mobile serial killer who operated across vast geographic areas and targeted marginalized victims. The fact that Kraft was able to murder at least 16, and potentially dozens more, young men over a period of 11 years was a direct result of the systemic bias against homosexual and transient victims, the severe limitations of interagency communication, and the absence of a centralized database capable of tracking predatory patterns across state lines. The case served as a critical catalyst for the expansion of the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program and the development of the National Crime Information Center's missing persons databases, as law enforcement leaders recognized that the jurisdictional fragmentation that had allowed Kraft to operate with impunity was a systemic flaw that had to be addressed. Furthermore, the discovery and decryption of the scorecard provided criminologists and behavioral profilers with an unprecedented window into the mind of a highly organized, narcissistic serial killer, demonstrating that for some offenders, the act of killing is not enough, and that the compulsion to document, codify, and preserve a record of their atrocities is an integral part of their psychological reward system. Randy Kraft spent the subsequent decades on death row at San Quentin State Prison, residing in a single cell on the condemned unit, where he continued to maintain his innocence, filing endless, exhaustive appeals that systematically challenged every aspect of his conviction and sentencing. Unlike many death row inmates who seek media attention or notoriety, Kraft existed in a state of silent, obstinate denial, never granting interviews and never acknowledging the existence of the scorecard or the mountain of evidence that linked him to the horrors. On May 12, 2022, Randy Stephen Kraft was found unresponsive in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. He was pronounced dead at the age of 77. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation stated that the cause of death appeared to be natural causes, a quiet and anticlimactic end for a man whose crimes were defined by such extreme, calculated brutality. The impact of Kraft's crimes on the families of his victims, many of whom spent decades waiting for an execution that never came, is an enduring testament to the profound and permanent damage inflicted by serial predators. The case of Randy Kraft serves as a grim and powerful reminder that the most dangerous monsters do not always wear their evil on the outside, that intelligence and a polite demeanor can be the most effective weapons in a predator's arsenal, and that the pursuit of justice for the most vulnerable among us requires a systemic commitment to communication, vigilance, and an unwavering refusal to look away from the darkness that hides in plain sight.